I'm going to make a half hollow form for enameling using copper. I have to use hard solder on the whole piece so that I can enamel it. And I've already done scoring and bending, which you can see in another video. This is two L-shaped pieces that have been scored and bent, and they fit together really nicely on this soldering block. And I'm going to flux all four seams. So the two scored and bent seams, and then the two edges where the piece comes together. Everything is going to have to be reinforced with hard solder. I'm going to use a solder pick to place little pieces of hard solder on each corner. You could use tweezers if you'd rather do it that way, doesn't really matter. Once I get all my pieces of solder on each corner, I'm just going to heat up my metal until the solder flows down the seam. Once you get your solder placed on all four corners, go ahead and heat up each side of the metal until the solder just flows right down the corner. I'm not going to bother pickling this, I'm just going to let it cool for a couple seconds and then quench it and dry it off really thoroughly. Sanding the side flat on a flat piece of sandpaper is a really important step, so don't skimp here. You want to sand until the whole edge is really clean and shiny. It also is really soft and annealed, so you may have to adjust your shape a little bit. I actually took advantage of that annealing to change the shape to something I thought was a little bit more interesting. I have a piece of metal that is really close in size to the piece I'm going to solder to, and I cleaned it by sanding it, and now I'm going to flux it. Notice how I have it propped up on a little tower of fire bricks so that I can access heating it from the bottom as well as from the top. I just want to make sure I flux that bottom sheet really well and flux the clean edge of the piece I'm soldering to it, and then I'm just going to set it all down here. I'm still using hard solder because I'm going to enamel this piece, so I can't use anything other than hard solder. And I've got pretty big pieces, like, I don't know, between a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch long or so, and I'm going to set them all around the outside edge of this piece with tweezers. I'm probably using a little bit more solder than I need, but I'd rather have too much solder at this stage than not enough because I really just want to heat this up quickly and hot and have this all solder in one operation. So I'm just kind of taking my time and placing solder all along the outside edge. You could put the solder on the inside if you want to also. Sometimes I just think it's easier on the outside, but it doesn't really matter either way. There's no reason to use lots of little tiny pieces of solder because you're just going to spend time kind of chasing those around as you heat the piece up. You also can't use one really big piece though, because when it melts it's going to ball up into a ball and it would just end up in one place on your piece. So the compromise is just to use sizes kind of like this. Once I've placed all my solder, I'm going to turn the torch on really low and just warm up that flux, because the flux is going to boil and bubble as it dries and the solder can move. So I'm ready with my solder pick to move it back. It's gonna flow a lot better if it's touching both the bottom piece obviously and then the wall that is standing there. So I want to just dry my flux, and you'll see it's turning white as it dries, and then once it's dry it kind of acts like a glue that holds your solder in place. Just take your time here warming that flux up slowly so that you don't lose all of your solder flying away as your flux boils. This step always takes a little longer than I'd like, but it's pretty important so that you keep all of your solder in place. As the flux dries, it gets more and more sticky, so you always have to use heat in order to move it around. So you just want to get really comfortable with using that solder pick in your dominant hand and your torch in your non-dominant hand. As soon as the flux is dry, you want to really turn up the flame on that torch and get this piece really hot. And then you're going to try and really point that blue cone at the bottom sheet. You don't really want to aim it at those upper walls because they're up in the air and they're going to get hot quicker. They're also smaller. So I like to kind of lift my piece up off the brick if I can, so that I can get that bottom sheet as hot as possible. If I am heating from underneath, my piece is going to get dirty quicker, so I really want to go in with a really hot flame and get this solder to flow as quickly as I can before my flux burns away. So you'll see I'm just heating this piece really hot, trying to focus the flame on the bottom sheet, which is bigger, and you can see that silver line kind of running around the bottom, which is what I want to see. I want to see that solder flow all the way around the edge. Use your heat to just drag that solder everywhere you need it, and you want to see it flow all the way around your edge. If you end up with a gap, you're going to have to pickle your piece to clean it and then reflux and add more solder. I like to just try to get this all done in one time. It saves me a lot of time. It is really important that there's no gaps though, so if you have to do it more than once to get it right, that's fine. I like to cool my piece slowly so that I don't get it to warp when I quench it. So this piece is about to be quenched and then pickled. After your piece is completely soldered and it's pickled, you're going to want to saw off that extra metal. So here I'm just going to use my jeweler saw, and I want to saw as close to the edge as possible. I don't want to accidentally saw into the wall, but I don't want to leave a big flange that I'm going to have to file off later either. So take your time and saw that off really closely. I'm going to speed this up to save some time, but really take your time and saw as precisely as you can. And you'll see here, you can see how close I got. So that looks pretty good. I'm just going to saw the whole rest of the edges off, and then I need to file any little extra flange there. I want to make this like a perfectly seamless object. So I just want to use my hand file, use the biggest file you can for an edge like this. I'm using a half round file because I've got that concave curve there. And I'm just going to use the push stroke of the file, and I want to file until it's totally flush. I can pretty much completely eliminate that seam. After I filed it flush, I'm going to switch over to a sanding stick, and I'm going to just sand out the big file marks. And I can use a pretty coarse sandpaper on this. I am going to cover this with enamel, so you're not really going to see that surface, but you'd see any irregularities. It would be really important that you don't have gaps here or big gouges. And so I'm just going to sand to finish. Then you could do any other metalsmithing you need to do to this piece, but this piece for me, I think I'm going to be ready to pickle it and enamel it.